In 1988, David Mirvish was producing A Man for All Seasons on the London stage with Charlton Heston in the lead role. At the time, Heston told Mirvish that he had hoped the show would be successful enough to justify moving the production to North America, where it could be played at the Royal Alexandra Theatre. Why was he so interested in this particular Toronto theatre? Well, it turns out that's where Heston had made his professional acting debut as a spear carrier in a 1947 production of Antony and Cleopatra. That's right, Moses began his career right here at the Royal Alex. I'm Grayson Miller.
And I'm Adam Weiser.
And this is Muddy York. This episode is about the Royal Alexandra Theatre. However, that is the last time that the full name will be used. Like all self-respecting Torontonians, Adam and I will henceforth refer to it by its proper name, the Royal Alex. The Royal Alex is the oldest continuously operating legitimate theatre in North America. You may have noticed a particular qualifier in that statement.
Oh, I love legitimate theater.
Originally, legitimate theatre was a legal term that meant plays. Any performance with music was either a ballet, an opera, or an operetta. Now, you might be thinking, the Royal Alex is constantly staging musical. Well, these days, a legitimate theatre is one that usually shows live performances. The oldest theatre in North America is the Walnut Street Theatre in Philadelphia, which opened in 1808. However, it was converted into a cinema during the 30s before being converted back to a legitimate theatre later. This is why the Royal Alex can claim the title of the oldest continuously operating legitimate theatre in North America.
The driving force behind the construction of the Royal Alex was named Cothra Mulock. He was young, only 23 years old, but he was already a man with enormous influence and money. The influence came from his father, who was a longtime MP and a cabinet minister under Sir Wilfrid Laurier. Mulock would use this influence to acquire letters patent from the royal family, which allowed the new theatre to be named after Queen Alexandra, wife of Edward VII. The Royal Alex is the only theatre in North America to have royal patronage. The money came from his mother, or more specifically, his mother's sister, who had married William Cothra, one of the richest men in Ontario and a descendant of Joseph Cothra, who had once owned most of modern-day Mississauga. Her husband left much of his wealth to her after he died, and she left it to young Cothra. This made him one of the richest men in town, and led to his nickname, the Boy Millionaire. I'd just like to take a moment here to send a message to any of my aunts who may be listening. None of you married the richest man in Ontario and promised to leave me his money. What's up with it? Seriously, you're letting down the team. At the age of 23, young Cothra was president of the National Iron Works, the Guardian Trust Company, and the Canadian Bread Company, a director of the Confederation Life Association, the National Trust Company, and the Imperial Bank of Canada, alongside a host of other business and social titles. He also owned most of the shoreline along Ashbridges Bay, but this was regarded as worthless swampland.
We can't say for certain what inspired him to build the new theatre. Toronto already had a first-class legitimate theatre in the Princess Theatre. The official reason was that he did it as a public and civic service to put Toronto on the map. Another possibility is that the theatre business was exciting and glamorous, unlike the rather staid businesses which provided most of his income. However, the best explanation is that he had been unable to purchase tickets for a sold-out show at the Princess and decided to build his own theatre in a fit of upper-class pique. We can't prove that last story is true, but if it didn't happen, then it should have. Mulock had 3 partners in his projects. 2 of them were the kind of upper-class corporate types that you would expect. However, the 3rd partner was a Jew who lived in the modest John Street home in which he'd been born. Lawrence Lol Solomon had worked his way up to become Toronto's weekend king. He owned a host of different amusements to entertain people on their days off, including restaurants, amusement parks, and sports teams. While the first two partners were mostly there to provide money, he was there to run things, and he would manage the Royal Alex for the next 24 years of its existence. The location chosen for the theater was a lot on the northwest corner of King and Simcoe. This hadn't become the entertainment district yet, but it was a high-profile downtown location, and unlike most Toronto locations, nothing had to be knocked down to make room for the new theater. Until it moved to its current location in 1891, Upper Canada College had been located on this block, and the lot where the Royal Alex would be built had been part of its sports field.
A bright young architect named John Lyle was hired to design the theater. Mulock told him to build me the finest theater on the continent. The only requirement was that the new building needed to have a steel frame. The primary reason goes back to one of Mulock's titles. He was president of the National Iron Works. Using a steel frame would provide public demonstration of the potential for steel frame construction, which was still a relatively uncommon building method. Using steel meant that the building's frame could hold the full weight of the balconies. They didn't require any support pillars that could obstruct views of the stage. The Royal Alex would be the first theater in North America with what were called cantilevered balconies. Mulock also used the steel frame to advertise the theater as fireproof. This was no small thing, as the lights and pyrotechnics used in performances meant that the theaters of this period would routinely burn down. Of course, we know that steel frame buildings can still burn, even if they're more fire resistant than a wooden frame building, so Lyle added what was called a water curtain. Primitive automatic sprinkler system fed by a cistern on top of the building. Finally, he had a handmade fire curtain made of woven asbestos and steel wire to shield the audience from any fires on stage. He had the word asbestos printed in large letters on the front, just so the audience would know that they were safe from any potential threat to their health.
At that current time. In designing the Royal Alex, Lyle had an advantage because Mulock was primarily concerned with elegance. Most theater owners were only interested in cramming in as many seats as possible to maximize the size of the audience and hence their profits. The lobbies in the Royal Alex might have seemed a little cramped today, but people at the time considered it unusually spacious because Lyle hadn't been forced to add any additional rows of seats to the back of the theater. The theater also only had 2 levels of balcony instead of the 3 that would have been built in most other theaters. The completed Royal Alex would have 1,525 seats, 300 less than the rival Princess and 700 less than the Majestic, then the largest theater in town. Additional detail is that when it opened, the Royal Alex was air-conditioned. This wasn't air conditioning as we know it. Instead, pit had been dug in the basement right next to the boilers used to heat the building. In summer, it would be filled with ice, and a large fan in the ceiling would draw the cold air into the auditorium. At the time, when theaters could be stifling hot in the summer, this system was more than a little clever. Lyle was given a budget of $350,000 to complete the Royal Alex. He wound up spending $750,000 instead. 10 years earlier, Massey Hall had been built at 1/5 of the cost. Amazingly, he got away with it. Mulock had told him to build the fanciest theater on the continent, so Lyle refused to cut a single corner, importing expensive materials like Italian marble, French fabrics, and Turkish wood paneling to achieve his desired effect. In the end, the Royal Alex would make him one of Canada's leading architects.
The Royal Alex would officially open on August 26, 1907, with a new musical called Top of the Town. The Prime Minister and the Governor General were both in town, and Mulock and Solomon were hoping that they would attend, but they had to settle for the Lieutenant Governor. The press response to the new theater was overwhelmingly positive. The house looked very handsome when seen under the full illumination of the electric lights, from the onyx-walled entrance hall to the auditorium, in which the tasteful harmony of the color scheme showed to great advantage. However, the critics were much less impressed with the show itself. The extravaganza does not secure an enthusiastically favorable verdict from a Toronto audience. At this time, almost all theater outside of New York consisted of road shows, productions that moved from place to place. Few North American cities were large enough to support a show for any significant length of time. Most of the time, companies would only spend a week in any one city. However, a successful production might regularly return. A show called Blossom Time would play at the Royal Alex 21 times over the next 27 years. At this time, all major touring productions were controlled by a cartel called the Theatrical Syndicate, and the syndicate owned a stake in the Princess Theatre, Toronto's other first-class legitimate theatre. They didn't appreciate competition, and one member of the syndicate promised to drive the Royal Alex into bankruptcy and turned it into a stable for the carriage horses used by people going to the Princess. This launched a rivalry between the Royal Alex and the Princess, which lasted until the latter theatre burned down in 1915.
Cawthra Mulock would die from Spanish flu in 1918, and his family moved to France after his death. From then on, Lol Solomon ran the Royal Alex, while Mulock's shares in the theater would be managed by the Royal Trust Company. Incidentally, if anyone has visited the Cawthra Mulock Nature Reserve in Newmarket, that's named for him. In 1919, the Royal Alex would host the largest show in history, Chu Chin Chow, a musical adaptation of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. The production featured 300 performers, a 30-piece orchestra, 8 donkeys, 3 camels, and 3 yaks, because you can't have a musical without them yaks.
Of course.
For all that, it played for just 1 week before traveling to the next stop on its tour. The 20s would be marked by the growing popularity of motion pictures and the conversion of many theaters into cinemas. Solomon refused to show films at the Royal Alex unless they were appropriately worthy, like Best Picture winner All Quiet on the Western Front, or a documentary about the royal visit to India. Later on, Fantasia would become something of a Christmas tradition with annual showings each December. Solomon would die in 1931. Only one of the original partners was still alive, and upon his death, all shares of the Royal Alex would be assigned to the Royal Trust Company, who would run the theater for the next 30 years.
As you might expect, the Depression was a disaster for theaters everywhere. In fact, the Royal Alex would be the only first-class legitimate theater in Canada to survive. But it wasn't pretty. In 1934, the Royal Alex was only open for 11 weeks. 19 shows were booked for the 1935 season, but only 5 were actually staged. The other productions went broke before they ever got to Toronto. Things didn't necessarily improve during the war, as rationing and travel restrictions limited theatrical tours. The Royal Alex responded by creating its own repertory company and producing its own musicals with local casts. Things would pick up in the late 40s and 50s, as Broadway produced a stream of popular musicals like Oklahoma, Annie Get Your Gun, and The Music Man, among many others. O'Keefe Center opened in 1960 and immediately cut into business at the Royal Alex. In 1962, the theater posted an annual loss for the first time since the Depression. By this point, all of the men who had created the Royal Alex were dead, and their heirs decided that it was time to sell. Various bids came from groups who wanted to knock down the theater and replace it with an office building or a parking lot. However, theater staff managed to convince the heirs to accept a lower bid if the buyer would preserve the Royal Alex. And let's give them some credit, because press accounts say that the highest bid may have been worth up to 30% more than the bid that they wound up accepting. In the end, they would sell to the only bidder who would commit to operating the Royal Alex as a theater.
Today, the name Mirvish is synonymous with theater in Toronto. But back then, Ed Mirvish was just a colorful discount store owner. By his own admission, he knew almost nothing about the theater business, but he said he knew a bargain when he saw one. The Royal Alex was promptly closed for a 3-month renovation. 2 important changes would be made during this process. All the seats would be reupholstered with the deep red color that they still have today, and more washrooms were added, which is very significant if you're trying to make a bathroom run during intermission. Ed wanted the ushers to wear old-style Edwardian livery, complete with epaulets, ruffled shirts, knee breeches, and buckled shoes. Unfortunately, these outfits were too hard to maintain, which is why the current theater staff wear much less interesting outfits. In all, the renovation cost twice as much as Mirvish has spent on the theater. He said, "As long as the theater's shut and the lights are off, your losses are manageable. But as soon as you open the doors, there's no limit what it can cost you." When the Royal Alex reopened on September 9, 1963, the Globe called it the most theatrical-looking theater this side of the Para Opera House or Covent Garden. In a nice touch, Lady Eaton was invited to watch the show from the same box she had occupied on opening night back in 1907.
Ed Mirvish liked to play the yokel, but he was a shrewd businessman, and he figured that theatergoers would appreciate somewhere to eat before or after the show. Today, there are dozens of high-end restaurants near the Royal Alex, but during the 60s, the area had become pretty run down. In 1964, Mirvish bought the warehouse next to the Royal Alex and converted it into Ed's Warehouse. The menu was preset to reduce costs. He would joke that the menu had 2 pages of food and 10 pages of booze. The decor was a mishmash of oriental vases, Tiffany lamps, bronze statues, antique photos, and photos of theater stars. It was considered garish at the time, but today it would be completely unremarkable. The restaurant was hugely successful and would soon be joined by Ed's world-famous Italian, Honorable Ed's Chinese, Ed's Seafood, Old Ed's, which was more casual, and Ed's Folly, which was a lounge. One of my big memories of attending the Royal Alex as a child was looking down King Street and seeing sign after sign for a restaurant named after Ed. At the time, I had no idea who Ed was, but obviously he was important. The restaurants lasted until 2000 when the last one closed. In the end, they were a victim of their own success. Other restaurateurs noticed how busy they were and began opening their own places nearby. This would mark the birth of the entertainment district as we know it today.
Since opening, O'Keefe Centre had hosted the largest theatrical productions to visit Toronto. It had more than twice as many seats as the Royal Alex, and that created an obvious incentive for producers who wanted to sell tickets. But Ed Mirvish wanted to re-establish the Royal Alex's status as one of Toronto's preeminent theaters. To appeal to producers, he pointed out that the O'Keefe Centre schedule was largely full. A successful show couldn't extend its run because other performances had already been booked. He offered the Royal Alex as a theater where a successful show could run indefinitely. The producers of Hair were interested and licensed the creation of a Canadian production of the Broadway hit. It ran for just more than 12 months, an unheard of run for a Toronto show at the time. Hair's success had a big impact on Ed Mirvish's son, David. And when his father began to turn over control to him in the mid-80s, he wanted to mount more Toronto productions instead of relying on touring British and American shows. For that, he created Alexandra Productions, which would become Mirvish Productions. The new production company was moderately successful. However, the big breakthrough came when Cameron McIntosh, described as the most successful, influential, and powerful theatrical producer in the world, contacted Mirvish about mounting a Canadian production of his latest London hit. Les Miserables opened on March 15, 1989, and became a blockbuster. It ran for 14 months, departed for 4 months national tour, and then returned to the Royal Alex for another 13 months. This was the beginning of a golden age for the Royal Alex and Mirvish productions. Less than a year after Les Mis closed, another show called Crazy for You would begin another 2-year run of the theater. In 2000, Mamma Mia began a run that lasted more than 5 years and included 2,044 performances.
In 2016, the Royal Alex would close for 6 months for its first full renovation since Ed Mirvish had first bought it. The biggest changes were to the seats. Until then, the Royal Alex had been using the same seat frames and armrests that had been installed in 1907. These were replaced by slightly larger seats, which reduced the theater's capacity by about 250. More unfortunately, the wire frames underneath the seats were also removed. These had been installed to hold gentlemen's hats. So if you are planning to wear a top hat to your next show, there will be nowhere to put it.
Oh my gosh, where are we going as a society?
Amen, man. It really makes you think. The Royal Alex would reopen in November with Come From Away on its last stop before heading to Broadway. The show would return in 2018 with a Canadian production that was going strong as 2020 began. Unfortunately, the show, like just about everything else, drew to a screeching halt during COVID. Performances would be suspended from March 2020 to December 2021. Just 1 week later, David Mirvish announced that the show would be permanently closing and blamed it on the fact that the government wasn't giving him any money. The theater has since resumed playing a combination of short-run shows from the Mirvish subscription series and longer-run shows like & Juliet, which will be playing there until the end of March. Now, the Royal Alex isn't the nicest theater in Toronto. I'd argue that's the Princess of Wales. And it's not the most stylish. There's other theaters that show sort of hipper, more offbeat performances. But it is the grand old lady of Toronto theater. It was there when Toronto theater was almost literally just one theater, the Royal Alex. And here's hoping it will still be there as the Toronto theater scene continues to expand. So thank you for listening to this week's episode. Gray, where should people contact us if they want to get a hold of us? This week's episode. Gray, where should people contact us if they want to get a hold of us?
Oh, this is my turn this time. I definitely don't have this written down. But guys, I want to tell you, make sure to check out our newest platforms. You can find us at Muddy York Podcast on both Instagram and TikTok. You could also, if you want to reach us on email, it's muddy_york@outlook.com. And then what are the other ones? You can find us Toronto History. They're all different. That's the problem. What are the other ones?
So it's hard. You couldn't remember just off the top of your head. How about?
I've never done it before. You've done it 55 times.
You've heard it 55 times.